This is a brief tutorial on lighting and rendering in Maya. I'm going to light the interior of this room using a series of spotlights, a mesh light, and an area light, and we'll cover each of those. First, I'd like to light this room in a very general way using a spotlight above the entire environment. I'll start by holding down the space bar, going to create lights, and then I will go to spotlight. Now, very often there's something in the middle of our model that's hiding the cone shape that represents the spotlight, so you might find yourself needing to hit 4 on the keyboard to locate it. Once I've located, I'll drag it up directly above the top of the room, and then I'm going to rotate it and point it down. I could rotate it on the X or the Z, and I can do it manually if I wanted, or I could punch in -90 for X or Z, or I could hit T on the keyboard, and with that I could take the target area and point it down as well. Now, while I've hit T on the keyboard, I'm going to take the target and I'm going to drag it down to the grid below. And I'm just going to introduce a little intensity to the light in the light attribute editor. I'll make the intensity 5. And then I'm going to go down and open up the Arnold tab for the light, and I'll make the exposure to begin with approximately 3.5. Now, your interior might be brighter or darker, and these lighting changes would be made subject to any particular environment that you may have. Now that I've got a general light in, I'm going to bring up the Arnold render window so I can refine that. And once I bring up the window, I'll click on the red triangle, and I should see some form of lighting inside my model window. I'm going to center this a little bit more in the interior. And then I'm going to go to the attributes, and I'm going to change the cone angle, and then by increasing that I increase the scope of the light. Now, because it's an interior light, it needs to be very soft and ambiguous in some of the corners of the rooms. That would be adjusting the penumbra angle. So I'm going to drag the penumbra angle to the extreme right to 10, and my light does two things. It softens on the edges but also increases in circumference. Had I gone the other way to -10, I would get the softened edge as well, but the circumference of the light would be reduced. So once again, it really is subjective to your needs. Now, I want this light to be a little bit higher, so I will get the cone and drag it up a little bit higher in the interior. Now that I've got a general light, I'd like to concentrate the light on the chair by itself. And to do that, I need to have the light I introduced to be a little bit more of an ambient light. And all that means is I'm going to drop the intensity. Now I'm going to drop this a bit. I can always adjust it later, but it's dark enough now so that I can put another light over the chair, and it'll be a little bit more evident that my intention is to light the chair a little bit brighter. Now, since I already have a light started, I can simply duplicate the one I've just adjusted. So I'll hit Command D and my room will get brighter. I'll drag the cone or the target area down closer to the top of the chair. I'll move the target perhaps to the cushion. And now I'm going to go to the attributes for that chair light, and I'm going to make the cone angle much smaller. And I'll probably bring up the intensity a bit. Now at this point I would probably go back and forth and adjust the brightness of that newly introduced light. Perhaps it's too bright now. Or I might go and drop the ambient light of the original down a bit so there's more of a dramatic contrast between the two. So with that main light source in the ceiling selected, I will reduce the brightness. You can see how easy it is to manage the lights in your environment. The next thing I want to do is I want to add light to the lamp in the corner of the room. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the lampshade, because if I were to hit F now, I can get very close to it, and now I can see it pretty clearly in the Arnold render window. And I'm going to make the lampshade itself a little brighter and then give it some transparency. So the first thing I'll do is I'll select the polygon, and I'm going to go where it has the poly shape 1. And I'm opening up Arnold, and I'm turning off the opaque. So you'll see when opaque is checked, there's no translucence. Once I click off on the opaque, and then I deselect and select it one more time, this time going to the render node, I can now go down to where the geometry is. And in geometry, I can change the opacity. And the darker the opacity color picker becomes, the more translucent. Now I'm playing with the translucence, and I'm also opening the emission tab, because in there I can change the color of this feature, and I can add a little brightness to the lampshade that way. Now that I've done that, I'm going to zoom back on this, and I'm going to add a mesh light to this. And a mesh light allows me to duplicate my geometry for my lampshade and convert it into a light source using the Arnold mesh light. So to do so, I'll select my lampshade and I'll hit Command D. I'm just going to move that up a little so I can see the second one and get added easier when I select it. I'm now going to the Arnold tab on my shelf. And on the far left hand side, you'll see a series of yellow icons. I'm going to click on the yellow cube, the second icon in from the right. And when I do that, my lampshade immediately gets brighter. So all we've done is we've substituted that piece of geometry as a light source. You'll notice that once you've done that, you have to recenter your pivot, because the change we made defaults the pivot to the center of the viewport. So I might tweak that, make it a little bit larger so that it engulfs the shade completely. Now I've got it throwing a nice soft green glow, but there should be a light around the base of the lamp where the actual light falls. I'm going to duplicate the cone light over the chair. I'll select it, hit W, Command D to duplicate, and I'm going to use my perspective views to put this into position. And the orthographics, I'll hit T on the keyboard so I can manage the target area so that it falls at the base. And now we've got a light falling from the lamp itself. I'm going to go to light attributes. I'm going to adjust the intensity. And I might even change the color of it and add a bit of a green to it. You'll find that once you start adding color to your lights that the values become darker, and you may have to increase the intensity of the light as well. We're going to introduce a thing called an area light, and it's going to point directly at our door. So I'm kind of moving in on that area, and I'm going to go up to Arnold Lights, and then I'm going to use area light. And you're going to see a green mesh box appear with a perpendicular green line coming from the center. The perpendicular line in the center is the direction which the light falls from or emanates from. So as I move this, you can actually see in the render view now it's starting to get brighter. Just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to bump the intensity up a bit, and we can see how that works. And you'll see now, just based on the square parameters of that area light, the light is being caught on the door alone. I'm going to hit R on the keyboard now. I'll simply scale this so that I can perhaps control that light a little bit more. And you can see how easy that is. And unlike the regular mile lights, which gives us a transform with T, the area light does not allow that. So if I were going to rotate this, I would have to use my rotation tool or the numbers in the channel box to make those adjustments. Now once my lights are in my interior the way I want, I'm going to test the render to make sure that the renders will be true to the Arnold render view. I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go to Save Image, and the default setting is a JPEG, and that's fine for what our needs are. I'll send this to the desktop, and I'll call it room render test _1, and I'll hit save. Now I'm going to access that from my desktop, and I'm going to put that image side by side with the render view that I see in the Arnold render view. And they look pretty true. Now you have to be really careful, because very often you'll run your renders, and then if you happen to look at them afterwards and the lighting is completely dark, it's because you didn't test it first, and it probably because in the render view this alpha slider right here probably was changed from 0 to some other number. So you have to be sure that you've got that set up properly before you do all of your renders. One last thing to note, that our lights will throw a harsh shadow even though the penumbra angle softens the perimeter of the light itself. The objects that cast the shadows have a harder edge. If I wanted the shadows to be soft, as they might be in interior, I would select the light in question. So I'm going to start with the light directly over the chair because of that shadow we see. And I'm going to go to the attributes on the right hand side. And I'm going to go to the Arnold tab. And down below in the Arnold tab you'll see radius right below samples. And the further you drag that to the right, the softer the shadow being cast will be from the objects that hit it. So that's one other thing you may want to introduce, considering we're rendering interiors. And that concludes the tutorial.